thank you, both Marian and Peter, for putting this wonderful event together, and thank you all for coming. When Marian first invited me, she gave me a fascinating brief for this presentation, which hailed a number of different strands of thinking that I've been engaged with over the past few years. And her prompt included things like the following. The ways in which TEI tags might be used experimentally to help enable the marking up and analysis of the construction of queer identity in specific textual contexts, the ways in which issues of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and cultural and linguistic diversity might help us think afresh about the practice of text encoding, case studies and examples in which issues of gender, sexuality, etc. Have presented challenges to the TEI guidelines, perhaps resulting in the changes or the emergence of new strategies, and then examples arising from my current work that involve uncovering marginalized voices. So these are really complex problems, and in order to understand how any of this is possible to think about, that is, what kinds of challenges issues like ethnicity or sexuality might pose within a markup practice, or how these structures might be represented or not representable in markup, I think we first need to think about how markup is understood to make meaning, and what kinds of meaning it has the capacity to make in itself as a representational system, apart from the semantics that we might associate with it. So I'm going to start with some framing ideas about how markup systems work, first at a theoretical level and then in their specific signifying capacities, thinking in particular about how concepts like diversity or queerness or identity might inflect the ways that we imagine the capacities of markup as a representational system. And then I will turn to some more concrete examples drawn from the Women Writers Project and others, including the Shelley Godwin Archive, which seems to have been a kind of magnet for us today, which I hope will help spark some ideas that we can then explore further in the discussion. So, we need to observe at the outset that markup is fundamentally a formal language. That is to say, it is a system of symbols that can be combined and manipulated using formal rules to produce unambiguous results. And it has its origins in, first order logic and all of that kind of, the kinds of things that also give us other kinds of formal languages like programming languages. And there's a strong debt here to structuralist linguistics in the stipulation that meaning emerges from a general linguistic system, not from individual meaning-making acts. And that individual signifying gestures only achieve meaning differentially in relation to all of the other signifying components of the system, even in cases where we want to insist, rightly I think, on the capacity of specific markup languages to express individual interpretive moments or markings. And individual terms within a markup language, in the case of XML, elements and other signifying components, have no inherent semantics. So in other words, the apparent significance of any given term in markup is purely and overtly an effect of difference, of differentiation. And then secondarily, it's an effect of convention and social consensus. So from the structuralist roots that I'm marking here, this idea is baked into markup, particularly XML forms of markup, as we understand it, as a signifying system. And hence, in its design, text markup of the kinds that we're talking about here, as an intellectual tradition, I think does not in itself contain a mechanism for privileging a particular value orientation within a system of difference, even though it's clear that, culturally speaking, power structures and differentials are inevitably mapped onto such systems of difference, such operations. The language of diversity, the term diversity, I think offers us a complexly conflictual positioning with respect to such formalisms. It asks us to view identity as something that's authenticated by individual experience rather than by a regime of information or governance. And here I think Marcus's mind and mine sort of proceeded along similar lines in how to frame this problem. The term diversity asks us to respect individual human self-attribution of identity using publicly intelligible categories, or perhaps not. But at the same time, the concept of diversity arises and has been naturalized in institutional and managerial contexts, for example, human resources, with good intentions, but with the result that it tends to operate through categorization and nomenclature. And even where the language of diversity construes categories of identity in an intersectional way, it nevertheless leaves in place their nomenclature and their apparent descriptive power. In practical ways, so for example, as a way of identifying progress towards greater diversity, as a way of allocating things like attention and resources. So the ability to have a kind of lexicon of diversity categories allows bureaucracies to discover whether, in fact, women are increasing their representation in the ranks of tenured faculty. If we didn't have the category of woman in the first place, that would be harder to track. But at the same time, it produces edges which are insufficiently complex. Also, I think, perhaps less wittingly, this sort of institutional version of diversity acts, of course, as a kind of irresistible simplification, right? It's easier to work with simple categorizations. Something about the way brains like mine, at least, are wired. And this affinity for simplification finds its complement in the widespread human tendency to create or understand identity in relation to groups, right? So the logic of self and other can be, especially in cultural contexts that reinforce it, somewhat hard to escape. The project of queering and the language of queering as applied to information technologies, such as Fiona Barrett et al.'s QueerOS, has the potential to envision the dismantling of formal systems, I think, in a much more thorough way than the language of diversity. It focuses specifically on the ways in which categories of identity are constructed, while also providing a name for such a category that is deliberately and explicitly a non-category, right? So it's one that refuses the project of differentiation. And by supporting a sense of identity that does not require a formal set of recognition criteria, such as the possession of a specific physical configuration or a specific set of behaviors or affinities. However, I have to say, I'm still looking for good examples, and in fact, if some come to mind for you, I'd love to hear about them, in which this kind of dismantling has been applied in any systematic or detailed way to actual technical systems. So Fiona Barnett et al.'s QueerOS, I think, self-avowedly functions more as a kind of meditation on queerness and doesn't address what it would mean to imagine, let alone to implement, a queered version of any actual formal system, like an operating system. Kara Keeling's earlier article with a similar title, QueerOS, similarly treats operating system as a metaphor, albeit a very useful one. And while suggesting broadly that a queer approach to digital media would, quote, insist upon forging and facilitating uncommon, irrational, imaginative, and/or unpredictable relationships between and among what currently are perceptible as living beings and the environment in the interest of creating values that facilitate just relations. I should have put that on a slide, I'm sorry. While suggesting all of that, it doesn't get to the point of asking what this would look like as a matter of specific digital practice or digital design. Jacob Gaboury's Queer History of Computing addresses that history in much more detail, but fails to find any cases where queer identity, inhering in actual practitioners within that history, actually produced any kind of alterity in the computing systems that were being produced. On the contrary, in the overall narrative of this history, the crucial role played by queer men and women in the development of computing technologies suggests that queerness was completely consistent with the form those technologies have taken. And he says, queerness is itself inherent within computational logic, which is interesting if we're thinking about those systems as resting on those kinds of formal terms that I suggested at the outset. Gaboury suggests that, quote, if we understand queerness as a process of self-shattering rather than self-fashioning, then we begin to align it with these exceptional objects and practices that exist beyond the limits of a system such as computation. And I'd love to see this point explored in more detail, because he kind of puts it out there and then it's kind of over. In the case that he examines most closely, that of Wittgenstein and Turing, the two men disagreed over precisely the question of how formalism functions or should function in mathematics and computation. And as Gabori puts it, quote, "Getting statements free from contradictions is the very essence of mathematics." And I would also say that's the mission of markup languages. Turing perhaps thought Wittgenstein did not take seriously enough the unobvious and difficult questions that had arisen in the attempt to formalize mathematics. Wittgenstein thought Turing did not take seriously the question of why one would want to formalize mathematics at all. And just as a kind of personal aside, in the book that I'm co-editing with Fotis Ioannidis on data modeling, there's, as you can imagine, a number of articles that are really very optimistic about the potential for formalization, and also kind of skeptical and cautious and theorizing it and thinking about it and so forth. But the concluding coda by Michael Sperber McQueen is, I think, almost sums up this nexus, right? The question of how much can we formalize and what do we gain thereby, that seems to be sort of at the heart of this question. Anyway, I think what Gabori's article makes very clear is that that's not a question whose answer in one direction necessarily is aligned with queerness, where the other answer is aligned with something else. In other words, queerness is sort of at the heart of the question rather than as a position about an answer. So a final consideration to bear in mind here in these sort of preliminary thoughts, markup languages have historically arisen in industrial contexts where they serve to facilitate data interchange, either within a single organization, so allowing data to be exchanged among different tools in a workflow, or between organizations as part of an industry-wide agreement. And in some cases, markup languages have been given the status of formal standards, for example, like by a body like the International Standards Organization. In both cases, markup languages represent some kind of meaning consensus within an operational community. But this consensus may favor the powerful members of that community and may be used in the spirit of, better to use an existing standard than to be left out in the cold. The TEI has functioned in a similar way to establish the TEI guidelines as a community standard, with the goal of facilitating data sharing and interchange, and with some added complexity arising from the TEI customization mechanism, which permits the interchange not only of data and schemas, but also of modifications to schemas. In other words, the consensus the TEI offers is one that explicitly permits and even encourages dissent, which I think is a really interesting dimension that the humanities inflection of the TEI has brought to the table. Within the past 10 years, the TEI has also seen increasing use by individual scholars as an interpretive tool, and is being taught in a digital humanities context as a tool for close reading, a way to express individualized ideas about texts within very small groups of collaborators, or even within a group consisting of a solitary scholar. So in what follows, I think it'll be important to bear in mind the question of whether markup represents a community consensus about communication, perhaps a coerced one in the manner of sort of industry standards, or a set of individual communicative gestures. And in either case, how broadly intelligible the communication is intended to be. In other words, are we speaking here of sort of intersubjectivity, or are we speaking about a very private kind of communication, or are we speaking about some kind of attempt to produce a very highly formalized shared reality? So let's turn now to look more closely at some of the basic signifying features of XML markup. And I want to pay particular attention here to their capacity for a queer inflection, or their orientation towards questions of identity. Because the basic building blocks out of which markup constructs meaning, I think, need to be read for the effect they have on what we can say with them. So let's start here. The starting point, the most basic feature of a markup language is naming and bounding. And these are fundamental. right? They are the things you need to do first when taking a text and turning it into some kind of formal information. So our first act is to identify the boundaries of a data element. And that's all this does, right? It just says, there's a thing here, and in it there's another thing. But even as we chuckle, we see how, in effect, how much of a step forward that is compared to the undifferentiated mass of text that we have on the left, right? We do learn something by simply identifying the boundaries of things. And then once we have enabled ourselves to identify the boundaries, we can also then go ahead and name those data elements and potentially and informally associate a semantics with that name. So we'll come back to that in a moment. It's important to note that naming is purely arbitrary here, right? The names of XML elements are not words in any language, and they're not intended to be. To the extent that they resemble words, like the word thing, this is for human mnemonic purposes only. However, of course, in a digital humanities context, the XML code, this marked up thing that we produce, has two audiences, one computational and one human. And because human beings are typically the ones generating TEI markup in particular, and are also often readers of this markup. So for example, I just administered the TEI language competence exam to several of my graduate students, so they now have a reading knowledge of TEI. The markup is actually signifying on two quite distinct bandwidths. The computational audience, this guy, doesn't register the meaning of thing or paragraph or poem, but the human audience does. And because element names do arise from human knowledge systems and cultural habits, they can't help signifying to us. We can't help treating these choices of nomenclature as significant. So if they are significant, here's an area already where questions of diversity and identity are visible. And it's interesting to think from a library taxonomy and language development perspective. I'm very fond of this article by Amber Billy and colleagues who offer a critique of metadata cataloging standards from a perspective of queer theory that problematizes the liberal project of diversity where information management is concerned. So they point out that gestures of categorization can be pluralized, right? We can update and expand our lists of descriptive terms so that they aren't just male and female or whatever those terms might be. But what they further point out is that the very gesture of categorization may itself be problematic. And if we think about this from the perspective of identity, it's interesting to think about the relation between labels and meaning, right? Identity politics is, in a sense, all about this connection. And markup disrupts this insistence on semantics, on a meaningful connection between the label, the term that we use for something, and the meaning, the identity of that thing. The tag in markup is just a signifier, and its association with a specific meaning or entity is purely conventional. But how we unpack this point, I think, depends on whether we think of markup as an individual scholarly act or a community standard act, right? If we're looking at a markup standard like the TEI, the labeling of elements and the connection between the label and the semantics is part of the consensus that's represented by the markup. We agree not to use the term paragraph when we mean quotation, or not to use the term sex when we mean gender identity. But if we consider markup as a more private exercise, then that consensus carries much less weight, and we are free in the privacy of our own, individual offices to create markup that may, say pretty much anything we want, with the proviso that it may not mean anything to anyone outside those doors. So differentiation is the next step in the process. After we've named and bounded things, we can differentiate between information elements using different names. And as we've noted above, this is an effect of pure difference. Syntactically, element and attribute names serve solely to differentiate. They have no inherent semantics. And they establish minimum recognition conditions, in effect, minimal pairs. In phonetics, minimal pairs are pairs of phonemes that differ in one phonetic aspect and demonstrate that the aspect in question is detectable and meaningful to speakers of the language. So extending this idea to markup, we might say that the minimal pair of features is one whose members are recognizable as different to speakers, i.e. encoders, working in that markup language. So in other words, signification arises from difference, and in a markup system, signification is purely an effect of choosing what things we will differentiate from one another. The signifying capacity of the language is entirely limited to the set of differences it recognizes. So a language like, HTML, for example, which has a comparatively limited vocabulary, allows you to make a comparatively small set of differentiations, and those differentiations have to do with behaviors of data in a web publishing context. The TEI, which has a much, much larger vocabulary, allows much greater differentiation, a much greater set of things in the world that it can acknowledge the existence of and describe. From a diversity perspective, we can differentiate in our markup languages at arbitrarily fine grain, right? We can imagine a markup language with, hundreds of thousands of elements. We can imagine a markup language as rich as a human language in its ability to differentiate. But it's difficult to get from, the arbitrarily fine grain differentiation at that next to the top layer, to get from there to a smooth continuum, right? We can't go in markup languages from this discrete information to smooth information. Markup, for the most part, is very good at representing discrete pieces of information, but it's not very good at all at representing the sort of the continuities, the edges, the places in between the boxes, in effect. It's sort of like integral calculus. Markup does not do integration. So, but, the saving grace here is we can differentiate according to any descriptive rubric we choose. So if we believe in diversifying our descriptive taxonomies and making them more responsive to alterity, markup languages can align well with that project. However, if our political project involves refusing the concept of difference altogether as a basis for representing human identity, then markup languages may not be a perfect fit. But in that case, it would probably be difficult to imagine any other digital representation system that would be better in this respect. So at this point, we can observe usefully that XML is a tree structure. And if we didn't know it before, the examples we've seen so far have hopefully given us a sense of it. And in addition to being represented as a tree, as in that middle diagram there, it can also be represented as a set of nested structures. Each child node, in a sort of genealogical sense, is contained within its parent node. And this has several implications, specific implications informationally. It implies that the contained structures are part of the containing structure, and that may seem obvious. And that fact is also transitive. So if a paragraph is part of a chapter, the paragraph is also part of the novel of which the chapter is a part. And containment is also a mechanism by which XML can associate related pieces of information. So for example, choice, which we spoke about before lunch, associates multiple possibilities with one another, right? It expresses them as alternatives. Or in the case of a bibliographic citation, the citation expresses the connection between the various facts of publication that are being described. Containment entails that information is inherited from the parent or ancestor by the child. So for example, language or authorship or handwriting cascades down from the outside towards the more precise elements. And knowledge and informational inferences can also flow up and down the tree and thence to other parts of the tree in ways that are useful to search engines and other XML-aware programs. So for example, we can infer the language of a specific part of the text from information that's available at a higher level. Or we can infer information about what a larger thing possesses by navigating our way through that containment structure. In a more general sense, we can understand each element in the XML tree not as just itself, right, a single node, but rather as a path that has its origin at the root. So you can think of this line not as just line, but as line inside stanza inside poem, right? That's really what that line is. So from the perspective of our larger theme here, the properties of inheritance, of information inheritance, suggest that meaning is necessarily contextual, not atomistic or purely local. And this could be, I think, both an empowering and a disempowering reflection. If information located elsewhere in the system is essential for understanding a particular informational node, if in fact the specific node isn't really a complete independent unit, do we construe that in a sense of historical determination as a statement about human identity in relation to society? Like, I mean, I can see that going in a bunch of different ways, and that might be something we can think about in the discussion. Considering the tree structure as a whole, one obvious point to note is the way that it represents the document as an information hierarchy, right? Strongly organized and shaped in its overall structure by the provisions of a schema, which is expressed somewhere else and which provides the rules that set the requirements for what may and may not be present in the document. And we can frame that in both positive and negative ways, right? We might say that the document is organized and shaped by the schema, or we could say it is ruled by the, Procrustean dictates of the schema, sort of depending on our mood. However, if we compare the XML tree to other forms of information organization, for example, a relational database, we see that, in fact, it has a potentially weaker and much more variable form of determinism, right? The grammar that is the schema can provide for very open-ended and potentially infinite forms of variability, or it can constrain the document set in very limiting ways. So for example, this is a tiny little schema, and you don't even really have to be able to read schema languages to see that this document is basically, it's a poem, it has to begin with metadata. The metadata has to contain a title, author, and date in that order. Then there are stanzas. There must be at least one stanza. Each stanza must have at least a line, right? It's like a very kind of rigorous conceptualization of the poem. And on the right, we have the TEI. And I'm not obviously going to show you the TEI schema because it's, that big. But you can get a sense of the kinds of variability of data that the TEI schema can produce. It is literally, there are an infinite number of possible documents that the TEI can represent. So we might say, less vaguely, more accurately, that the schema provides the potential for a strong or weak determination of the structure of the document. There are a few other features of schema languages which I haven't done as thorough, or I haven't sort of gotten my mind around where their potential queerness or potential significance for our theme, and I'll just mention them in a briefer way so we have them in our heads. The first of these is sequencing, right? Unlike a database, in XML, the order of nodes within a given context is informationally significant. So for example, the chapters in a novel or the lines in a poem are understood to be in an order. We're free to ignore that order, but in terms of the XML data, the order is treated as significant. And from a digital humanities perspective, we can understand XML as, in general, a space of narrative, where the database is a space more of reference and manipulation. And I think also, from a digital humanities perspective, we can understand XML as a space in which identity can be rooted in narrative context rather than being managed in a purely informational way as it would be in a database record. And I think the relationship between narrative and identity is worth probing further, but for reasons of time, I don't want to go into it here. The final basic feature of XML is the link, the ability to establish an explicit informational connection between two or more places within an XML document or a group of documents. And with HTML in mind, we naturally think of a link as navigational, right, as enabling narrative movement or representing our own mental traversal of the document as readers. But in fact, it's a much more flexible and polymorphous concept. In TEI, these links, in other words, URLs that point to things, can serve a huge variety of purposes that access information, for example, related to a specific entity, as we saw in Marcus's information where he has names and places that are referencing out much more complex data structures. Here we have something similar. So here's representing somebody who is mentioned in a project personography. The Olinda is a pointer to a dramatis personae. The value of Anna is pointing to a lexicon of thematic keywords. The enth is pointing to some renditional defaults. So there are lots and lots of different things that links can be used for. And a link always has directionality. So it always points from the element with the URL to the element with the ID. It requires uniqueness of the endpoint. The thing being pointed to is always assumed to have a kind of unique informational identity within the system. And a link can point to multiple endpoints. From the perspective of our theme of diversity and identity, the link creates the capacity to establish interconnections. And this capacity, I think, provides an important counterstructure to the tree hierarchy, to the ways to the sort of clearer, more fully rationalized and enforceable forms of structure that the schema provides. And it establishes the potential for multiple documentary logics, one of which is guided by a central theory, the schema, which could be construed as sort of a totalizing, organizing principle for the text, and the other of which has the capacity to be opportunistic or occasional or fortuitous, which is the logic of the link as described here. So finally, I want to conclude this sort of initial tour of the features of XML with a few reflections on the role of the schema, which we've sort of named with this hand gesture. So the schema is a set of formal rules that govern the behavior of a particular XML markup language. And there are two major modes in which schemas can operate, one of which is descriptive, broadly speaking, and the other of which is, broadly speaking, normative. Descriptive schemas describe our observations and resulting expectations about things that already exist. Right? The schema, in this case, responds to or reflects an environmental scan or a document analysis, which in turn reflects the observing eye. Right? It provides a theory of the world that is really derived from the complexity of the world, and that is interested in the complexity of the world, or in our case, we might say it's respectful of the complexity of the world. In a disagreement between a descriptive schema and the observed reality wins, right? The schema gets revised. And there are formal processes for this, called things like document analysis. So if you are producing a descriptive schema like the TEI, the first thing you do is you look at documents, and you sort of take them seriously, and you think about your relationship with them. And then you start to write a schema that will be adequate as an account of that relationship. In a normative schema, the schema describes an ideal state to which the data will be made to conform. And forms of conformity or constriction might involve omission, or elision of difference, or creation of artificial distinctions, or assignment of inappropriate semantics, which in the XML world is called tag abuse, which I think is a wonderful term. Basically taking an element and using it for something it wasn't intended for, because the markup language doesn't include a term for the thing that you really intend. And it's worth noting that any of these outcomes, these elisions or constraints or misapplications, might result from simple inattentiveness, right, human intellectual frailty, or from expediency, so pressure from a work process or a tool, or they might result from ideology, right? In other words, there are ways in which schemas can represent a deliberate exercise of constraint in the service of a hegemonic position, or in the service of a counter-hegemonic position. The creation of a new local hegemony, let's say. And I think it's worth kind of pausing here and reflecting on the TEI as a schema. We've mentioned a couple of times now that the TEI is customizable, and I think that fact is very significant when we're trying to understand the potential of, for example, the TEI as a as a potentially queered or queryable information system, because as I said earlier, the customization mechanism and its function in the TEI consensus space is really a way of expressing dissent, right? It is a way of expressing dissent in a way that is an act of communication rather than an act of destruction. And I don't want to suggest by that acts of communication are always the most effective way of querying something. This is not an area where I would have authority to speak in any case, but it seems to me that there may be cases where acts of destruction are necessary. But I think that the TEI's choice to produce, in effect, a dissentable mechanism for consensus is an interesting one, because it's, in effect, a way of describing the sort of the intersubjective effects, potentially, of a markup language, right? If we think of markup languages as ways of communicating, then they will tend to be more robust when they allow us to also communicate disagreement. So I think that's a tool we might be able to put to use in our considerations of the queerability of markup languages. But I think it also requires us to be attentive to the kinds of customizations we're making. In other words, whether we are changing nomenclature or changing structures or changing the ways that we describe our practices. These are all things that can be changed and documented in the TEI, but they are distinct from one another. So it's not just that, you know, any customization, any change represents a kind of vital act of difference. Some will have more of an impact than others. So with this sort of initial repertory of representational functions available to us in markup, and particularly in TEI markup, I think we're in a position to consider how they might be used to represent identity in ways that are sensitive to the recovery and status of marginalized voices, and also to think about how these spaces of representation themselves might be queerable. So first, in trying to tackle this question of the queering of texts and so forth, and the representation of identity in texts, I found myself trying to come up with sort of an inventory of the spaces where we find identity operating in texts. And I was actually surprised by how many there are, and I don't think this is a complete inventory. I'm sure if we went around the room we could come up with a lot more. But so references to people and accompanying editorial apparatus, I think that's obviously a key one, and it's an area where the TEI has put a lot of investment and emphasis, right? The documentation of persons and other named entities, and the ability to associate specific places in a text with information about the entity named there is a very, very important part of managing identity, particularly in ways that help a certain genre of TEI project. In other words, a documentary project which has a historical emphasis and which needs to be able to explain its cast of characters, right? Its embeddedness in world history with reference to specific people. So here's a made-up example of a personography, just so we can kind of get a sense of what kinds of markup we're looking at here. And I'll have occasion to come back to this in a moment, but we can see already the kind of inventory that this represents of people and the things we can know about people. In addition to this somewhat straightforward representation of identity, there are also in texts spaces of explicit authorial claiming and attribution. So I'm thinking here of things like title pages, dedications, colophons, that sort of space. There also are spaces in the genesis of the text, for example, handwriting, where identity is crucial. So for example, we saw in the Shelley Godwin archive the ways in which the human traces in the document are spaces of identity, and clearly the Michael Field materials operate in a very similar way. Identity also is very present in editorial representations of identity. So things like annotations, for example, or biographical notes, places where the apparatus of the text names and manages identity for us. Shifts of narrative voice, I think, are a very important place to look for identity, and particularly where these are localized within specific literary spaces. So for example, the lyric, or the novel, or the religious meditation, or the autobiography. Those seem like spaces where we might be trying to find ways of capturing identity or identities in some signature, or I mean, I don't even know how one would do that in markup, but it's an interesting problem to imagine. But those clearly are very, very important residences for identity in the text. Akin to that, I think also personae are an interesting place to imagine localizing identity in text. And that, I think, because it doesn't map easily onto either people or specific genres, but is somehow more flexible and intergeneric, might require sort of more specialized markup resources. I'd also want to add to the list something I, in my notes, termed negative space. So archival silence, textual absence, elision, censorship. These are also spaces of identity that we can imagine ways to mark in the markup. And finally, the role of the encoder is a space of identity, right? The things we were talking about this morning, such as responsibility or uncertainty, in effect, the subject position of the encoder seems like a very important space to be able to mark identity, particularly since these digital objects circulate very much as made objects, right? They are not sort of abstracted away from their own process of genesis. They are human artifacts. And their capacity to mean anything is directly related to the encoding, the subjectivity of the encoder, or the conditions in which the encoder is working. So many of these phenomena that I've listed here exhibit identity in the text as complex phenomena that we apprehend in ways that we might not even be aware of. Right? They operate on many different registers. But to represent them in markup requires us to tune the focus of our attention to specific things that can be captured and formalized using the tools that markup actually gives us, which, as we've seen, are a very small inventory of tools, not terrifically subtle, honestly. Naming, bounding, differentiation, linking, containment, that's a small repertoire of signifying gestures. So I want to now start to think a bit about the tools that markup offers us and how we might model some of these different textual formations in ways that capture different inflections of identity. So one fundamental tool, as I said a moment ago, that the TEI offers us for representing identity in ways that can be very much about straightforward data management and editorial documentation is the personography, which is a kind of biographical database expressed in TEI. And I think it's interesting to note here how the personography anchors identity in what is known and what is knowable, right? It makes identity legible within a specific reading context by establishing almost a set of equivalences between people along specific axes of information by which they can be compared and aggregated. So here, in this imaginary personography, the sponsoring project, the editorial consciousness, has decided that the properties of personhood are to have a name, to have been born, to have been died, and to have an occupation, and also to have a sex and to have a role. And also to operate as a data point, right? To have an XML ID, which allows them to be managed within this data universe. So this, in effect, it creates a form of personhood which is informational personhood. And it simultaneously establishes the uniqueness, the boundedness, and the referenceability of each person, right? The capacity to be pointed to. And I realize with a slight chill just now as I'm talking, the analogy that I often use in workshops when trying to explain to students what an XML ID is, so that first attribute on the person element. My analogy is like the social security number, right? It's unique, it's the way that things point to you. And of course, April 15th just passed. We've all, we know what the social security number is for. It's so the government can, make sure you paid your taxes. And in a way, the referenceability of personhood as represented in the personography kind of operates the same way, right? It's a principle of discoverability and the ability to be managed within the system as an operator, as a piece of the whole. The personography operates in partnership with the text's own account of identity. For example, through personal names, as Marcus's example showed us, and other kinds of references. And the personography grounds that identity in some external informational space. It sort of shines a bright factual light on spaces of potential ambiguity, things like in the text, obliquity of reference, or name confusion, or mistaken identity, or cross-dressing. So if the text has several people named John Smith, or if the text has somebody in disguise, or if the text has somebody whose identity is not really ever fully elucidated, the personography exists as a space of resolution, of clarity, of release of ambiguity, in somewhat similar to the ways that you probably all experienced this as well. There's like the genre of taking something like Ulysses and turning it into a hypertext so that it can be read as a linear narrative. This is sort of what this does for identity. So this mechanism really insists on the uniqueness and factuality of personhood. And the normal organization of the personography, with all knowable facts organized within individual person elements, suggests that information about people inheres in their personhood rather than being established relationally, as a vector that might alter depending on its other endpoint. So one thing we might explore further as a kind of markup problem is how we could express facets of human identity that are not relationships, which TEI does have a mechanism for representing, but are inherently relational, right? For instance, information about a person that is only known to a few others, or that is known in different ways by different people. That, I think, would be a profoundly different model of personhood from what the TEI personography currently represents. As we've already observed, the personography operates in relation to references within the text, and these could take many forms. So there are overt names, so the text reading along and it says John Smith right there. It can also operate through more indirect references like pronouns or other non-name-like references like his mistress or the local librarian or whatever it might be. And it can also operate through ascriptions of responsibility, right? So in the case where a manuscript addition has been annotated onto the text, the encoder, by saying whose handwriting that addition is in, introduces a person to, that's a statement about identity in the text. Some of these textual references have additional significance that they acquire from context. So for example, statements of responsibility on a title page or dedication name identity by framing it within a specific functional context for the document. They speak of how this person is the author or the translator or the illustrator or the dedicatee. And in a similar way, the operations of bibliography, citation, allusion, verbal echoes, place identity within a specific kind of intertextual context. And from these contexts, we can infer further layers of meaning about identity. For example, demoted or subaltern identities. So this example is from one of the Women Writers Project texts, Changing Scenes. And I can't really talk and look at my slide at the same time. The different names are all given a kind of equivalence, right? Everardus, Calaman, Jude, Miss Cornelia, Tom. But we can tell from, for example, the inclusion or omission of honorifics. So Miss Cornelia is a different kind of identity in this text from Everardus, Calaman, and Jude. And the dog is a different kind of name altogether, right? The dog is not accorded in this encoding, is not accorded personhood. It's just a nameable thing. It's a nameable entity, but not a nameable human entity. So there may be sort of some boundaries to be thought about concerning what aspects of identity and what sort of power relations, inter-identity power relations, are expressed by the markup. Here, the clues are subtle and are not really explicit in the markup, but they can be picked up on by human readers. That might be something in another markup practice we might make more explicit. Another example here is authoritative identities and relationships. So this dedication to this is basically the translator's introduction to a text by a male author. But Sister Magdalene Augustine, who did the translation, has this introduction in which she names Marie Henriette, Queen of Great Britain, and the ceremony of naming in this particular context, in the context of a dedication, creates a relationship between the translator and the dedicatee, which is essential as part of as a framing of the overall project of this text and of turning it into English. And in a similar way, the TI header, the metadata that we create, situates the different kinds of responsibility, right? That it situates Sister Augustine as an author, and it also situates Luke Wadding as an author, but it gives other kinds of information that allow us to infer their sort of relationship within the ecology of the metadata. Identity is also pervasively present in the genesis of the document, both the source document and the digital representation. And if we leave aside the TEI header, where we can, of course, document a huge variety of document-level roles of all different kinds, including things like translators, illustrators, printers, booksellers, etc., we can represent, for example, the interplay of hands in a manuscript document. And I was also captivated by the Shelley Godwin archive as an example. I might even have chosen the exact same page that you did, I'm not sure. Essentially what the markup is doing here, as Marion already showed us, is ascribing responsibility to the different marks in the page and allocating them to variously, in this case, Mary or Percy Shelley. And the, in the case of a document whose, where that sharing of responsibility also has a kind of power dynamic, as I believe it does in this case, I think there's a lot more that we can read into identity just based on the simple fact of whose hands are on the thing. In a very similar manner, we might imagine representing the interplay of authorial responsibility of narrative voice in a multivocal document. And there might be many documentary scenarios where that kind of shared identity or split identity or distributed identity might be explorable. The ordinary informational function of the personography, the inventory of people like that, is to clarify and to disambiguate. It's to say, it is precisely this person. But what about cases where that's either impossible or overly literal? In 2009, the Women Writers Project produced a white paper on the encoding of names in which we described strategies for encoding cases of ambiguous, multiple, and figurative reference to identity, using a more indirect encoding that allows us to foreground the complex nature of these references. And I'll show you some examples. So here, for example, is a case where we have multiple simultaneous references, that is to say, one naming event which refers to multiple people. So in this case, the purse name, the ref attribute on purse name, which normally would point to a single entry in a personography to say, who is this person, instead points to a kind of intermediary piece of markup, which is this link. And it functions very similarly to what Marcus showed us this morning, where those, the person nexuses, right? Where a person in a place at a time was an aggregation of information. In a very similar way, this is showing us an aggregation of people to whom this person name refers. So Messrs. Ichus are, Aeacus, Rhadamanthus, and Minos, who are the three presiders over the underworld. So that's one way, potentially, of handling the multiplicity of reference that is possible in certain textual contexts. We might also have ambiguous reference, where we're not sure who's being referred to. So we might have a reference to Walpole, for example. We don't know, there are plenty of people named Walpole. It could be, we can narrow it down to two of them. And in the same way, that this link element lets us say it could be either of these people. And note that the type here tells us what kind of aggregation it is. If we look back at this previous example, it was multiple, meaning all are in play at the same time. This one says it's ambiguous, we don't know, we're expressing uncertainty. And a third type of sort of complex reference is in the metaphoric references that we often get in things like allegory or a roman à clef or something like that. So here we have Thyrsis and Daphnis in a poem who are both, themselves, right? I mean, the point of the poem is that we can read it at this sort of pastoral level, but they're also references to Froude and Creech, who were, actual people whom this poet was, lampooning or making a gentle jibe at or something like that. So these are, they may not apply to the specific cases, for example, that you're interested in, but they show the kind of structure that markup can provide through this kind of interaction that allows us to handle things that are not straightforwardly, this is who this reference is pointing to. So there's a lot more, as you can imagine, to explore here, and I hope that we can do it together in our discussion and experimentation for the rest of the afternoon. But I want to offer just a few final ideas that may suggest some directions for further thought. Sometimes the thing we're interested in isn't a single item of information, but an informational pattern or a violation of pattern. So in addition to looking at how we can represent individual edge cases or cruxes, I think it's also worth thinking about how our routine encoding, for example, something as simple as the capture of personal names, might serve as a kind of baseline or ground against which variations, the figure against the ground, becomes visible. And I think this is also more generally the impulse behind classification and formalization, the establishment of boundary conditions between a norm and an interesting exception to the norm. Right? You can't identify exceptionalism until you have decided what that baseline is. And these boundary conditions in the case of markup are typically or historically used in a workflow context, as Wendell Pease has argued very interestingly, to facilitate the kind of uniformization that is essential to large-scale industrial processes. So Wendell has a wonderful piece in which he talks about the emergence of interchangeable parts as part of the move away from artisanality and towards industrial work processes. He makes a very useful analogy to the role of a schema in which, in effect, the schema tests the data to discover whether it can, to discover its properties and discover whether it can fit into different contexts of usage. In effect, validity in the case of XML data is a statement about that data's fitness for use in a specific operational context. That view of things, right, that industrial way of understanding the role of the schema, and in fact the role of markup language generally, might seem to be asking us to identify queerness as a form of exceptionalism, right, as a violation of routine, as the grit in the wheels. And that might not be the direction that we want to go. Instead, we might aim for an encoding practice that resists the logic of routinization altogether. And remembering that those boundary conditions, right, the schema as a statement of normality, remembering that those boundary conditions are of our making, especially in the case of the TEI, we can treat the schema design and encoding process as one of creating the most intelligent or well-calibrated or respectful or inclusive or whatever edges possible for our concept of the norm, right? And to create a concept of a set of boundary conditions that serves purposes of world shaping rather than just of workflow. And I think that's really the intellectual task that the TEI sets us as digital humanities scholars or as scholars who want to use digital tools of this kind in a knowing way, really to understand the capacity, the world-shaping capacity of tools like schemas and markup languages, for all that they have this, this sort of intellectual indebtedness to systems that are quite rigid and brittle, I think that there's room for appropriation that really bears careful thought. So with that, I'll close. Thank you so much for your attention.
It's not so much a question, but well, thank you so much for the really generative presentation. Not so much a question, but I kind of wanted to think further this notion of what to do with signs, right? Mm-hmm. This whole notion of, we begin with a sign, right? And then how do we signify this, right? And so this is signification, and then the task of making anything X significant, right? So signification and significance, right? So the dual kind of sort of operations, both on the level of marking up, but also reading up, as it were, right? Sort of that I find it very interesting. So I wanted to think with you, if you are also interested in thinking about this further, this notion of design, which is what you ended your talk with, right? This is a design schema question that really, it's almost like a meta question of how do we then think about the box itself, right? As a way to unbox, right? Mm-hmm. The sign itself. And so that seems very just interesting way to not only to question certain politics and kind of discursive framing of the markup, the practice itself, but really to explore the idea of creative re-signification itself of the practice of this, marking up as you sort of explored. So sort of more practical question about design, but also design, I just looked it up, the etymology too, but it's really interesting, design, right? It has word sign, right? Design. And so this D is to as you know, is to out, right? So it's marking out, right? So on the one hand, we have a marking up, but we have a marking out, right? So this outing is a very interesting concept, I thought, right? So there's a potential for creating a space from within, like making it out, as it were, right? And so to think about this practice in terms of certain aesthetics and like a design attention, right? How do you think about this? And maybe because you're a specialist in this language, what are the sort of practical implications of thinking about this in terms of sort of design challenge, right? The conceptual question and design practice. So revolving around the question of sign, it's just a bit of a speculative, but I think it's interesting linguistic potential there. Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting. Thank you for that. That's actually quite suggestive. So I don't think I'll be able to unpack the full richness that is the potential of what you've said, but let me go in a direction that what you've said suggests to me. Because I think that the question of design, well, actually, there are two things I want to say. First is, I think the question of where design is located, or where we focus our attention when we imagine intervening in a design scenario, is very interesting. And I think that particularly in the digital humanities, where if you think of, I don't know which wave it is, let's pretend it's the third wave of digital humanities right now. Think of it as the wave that is suddenly, long overdue, attentive to the politics of signifying systems, of our tools. The question is, how do we read our tools, right? What parts of them are perceptible to us? What parts of them are intelligible to us? And then, once we are looking in the right place, what can we understand about what they mean? And I think that in markup languages, this is a particularly challenging thing, because the obvious places that we see when we look at, actually, here's a better example. The obvious things that we see when we look at what these tools produce don't show us the markup. Now, this is an exemplary project, at least partly because it does show us the markup, right? And Marion kept clicking between the output and the underlying stuff, and that's a great thing that the Shelley Godwin Archive does. So there's this surface layer which is very strongly designed, but it's the end point of a design process that is deeply layered, and where the relationships between the layers are as important as what is being signified by or at each layer. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that even when we click on that thing, what we see is markup. We're not seeing the schema. Okay, so here's another way that the Shelley Godwin Archive is awesome, is that they also share their schema. So I saw it on the page that you were showing us at the very beginning. So that's beautiful. And they don't just show us the schema. So this is going to be an insane descent into the abyss. We have the surface. We have the markup. We have the schema. Turns out the way the TEI achieves its customizability is that there's a meta schema. So underneath the schema, there's a blueprint for schemas of the TEI variety that allows us to generate schemas. So even more awesome, they share their odd file, which is the meta schema. Beautiful. Okay, so what lies beneath the meta schema? Underneath the meta schema is the meta language, which is XML, right? XML is not a language, it is a meta language. It is a syntax. It is a way of saying this is a tag. You can recognize it by the gesture that Julie always makes when she's talking about tags. Okay, so what's really interesting about XML, here I've just spent 40 minutes talking about the signifying affordances of XML and talking about the TEI as if those two things were somehow like this. Very interesting fact about the TEI, the sort of the history and future of the TEI, which is that the TEI is now starting to think about what it would look like, what it would mean to express the TEI in something other than XML. At its very outset, as Peter told us this morning, the TEI was in the early design phases before SGML, XML's predecessor, really existed. And the TEI, rightly at that time, said, what we are doing here, what the Text Encoding Initiative is seeking to do, is express a set of principles for describing texts which could be realized in this meta language, but could also be realized in other meta languages. Now, as it happens, the way things turned out, there was only one meta language worth considering, and that was SGML. And then after SGML, there was only one other one that was worth considering, and that was XML. And XML has been, fine, but it's not without its flaws. And in fact, if you go to the right conferences, you get steeped in all the ways in which XML, as we've seen, powerfully determines the ways we think with data and the ways that we think with this lexicon of concepts that the TEI has set out. I'm reminded here of, this is probably purely fictional history, but my personal ethnicity exposed me to the stories about the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth, and first they stopped in Holland and they spent a long time there, and then the reason they left was because they were becoming too Dutch and they needed to escape. The TEI has been in the Holland of XML for a very long time. There's a whole generation of TEI scholars and students who really couldn't imagine the TEI not being expressed in XML. It's natural for it to be in XML. Like, TEI is a tree structure, TEI uses pointing attributes. None of that is essential. So when we think about design, when we think about the design capacities or the design problem, we have to maybe, if you think in foundational terms, you almost have to start at that very bottom level and think very imaginatively about what your alternatives are, respecting both the mission of the sort of humanistic side of the TEI, but also, honestly, the mission of the computational side of the TEI, right? How can we do the things that projects like Marcus's or projects like the Women Writers Project or projects like the Shelley Godwin Archive seek to do that operate in that space between formalism and human intelligence, right? The space where both are happening, necessitating a compromise. My brain loves the idea of compromises, right? And that's my acculturation, and I think that's in some ways it's the you don't have to choose. It's sort of a Weasley approach. So I don't offer that as a true good thing. I'm just saying, sure, it makes sense to me. I like the idea of compromise, but you should draw your own conclusions. Anyway, that's what my brain does with your comment, and I hope it's useful. But I do think that the question of where we are in control of design decisions and where we are not, and what the consequences of the design decisions might be, is very, very complex in the digital humanities, and nowhere is that illustrated more clearly than in this particular case. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, and that actually kind of lends something that I wanted to ask anyway, and you kind of let me right to it, and I don't know who the best person to respond to that would be, but I'm just learning about this largely for the first time today. How path dependent do you think TEI is? Like, how much work would it be to unwind that clock and go back and start TEI down a different path that's not rooted in XML? Would you have to recode, all these would all the work we've already done be undone?
No.
Or no?
No, it would not. So I think maybe I want to just re-angle your question slightly, which is to say, the question isn't how we would do it differently back in 1989, but what we're going to do now, because that is exactly the question that the TEI Council is starting to think about. And I think that there's a sort of a two-stage process, and it's sort of like when you decide your house needs to be in a different place. It's like, first you have to decouple it from the bedrock, and then you have to produce a different bedrock underneath it. So the first step is to think about how the TEI, the TEI-ness of the TEI, right? What TEI calls the TEI abstract model. Think about what that is independent of the specific entailments of XML. So what are the non-tree-like, non-link, what are the fundamental concepts that the TEI itself is committed to? And how can we have that conversation with minds that are not stuck in XML mode? And then once we've done that, how can we draw a set of affiliations? How can we redraw the affiliation to XML in such a way that it can also separately be an affiliation to something else? And the TEI's intention to do this was expressed at the TEI Council meeting the TEI annual conference in Rome a couple years ago. Elena Pierazzo announced it. Was very challenging, very exciting, long overdue, many people felt. And I've had since then just a couple of conversations kind of opportunistically with people who are on the council and who are involved in it, and just enough to feel like smart people are on top of this, and I wish I had time to be among them and watch, but probably I will just learn as it unfolds. So I would say if you're curious about the how that's going, the place to go is the TEI Council's document, their meeting records, which are all public on the web at the TEI, and or post a question to the TEI listserv where information could be forthcoming. But I think as a philosophical question, it's sort of it's heady stuff, right? Because this is not something that one typically sees happening, right? Most digital humanities technologies are not conducted by people who are that thoughtful and that rigorous and that willing to punish themselves, with the hard work of following through on that rigor, right? It's kind of cool, kind of remarkable. But the real practical answer to your question is I don't know, and I think that the number of steps that have been taken are very small at the moment in comparison to what lies ahead. So I don't know really what it will look like or how it will happen. But give it 5 years. And so the other part of your question, which was, will the work need to be redone? I think the answer to that is no, because the goal of the exercise will be because it's being undertaken by the TEI, the goal is not to destroy everything that the TEI community has worked so hard to achieve, but rather to open up possibilities, because the world at large is also continuing to think about the expressive capacities of different notational systems, of which XML is just one. So you hear people talking about, well, why isn't the TEI expressed in JSON, or why isn't the TEI expressed in the thing I love best? And eventually, although it has not happened yet, but eventually one of those suggestions will actually be about a meta system, a meta language that actually does better than XML, is more powerful than XML, as opposed to being an impoverished underrepresentation of it. And so at that point, the process will be basically one of mapping. And there's not destruction and rebuilding, but rather saying, how do we map up to the abstraction that is the TEI purified of its entailments, and then back down, exactly. So I'm sure at the right time, smart people will come forward and do the right thing. But by then I will be a goat farmer, and I will be just reading about it in the newspapers. So.
Thank you for your reflection on that. That was really interesting.
Yes, thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, first of all. And this is actually kind of piggybacking on what everyone else has said. It's come up in the Fordham Center, actually recently, we've been having discussions about archiving and about what we do with all of this stuff. And so my question is twofold in terms that, so looking at especially querying TEI, we're talking about a lot of new tags, developing new schemas, and that's great, and that creates awesome possibilities. But my question is, how do we maintain intelligibility of the schema as we continue to expand it, and maintaining sort of what's been kept, keeping what's been going on in the past, but allowing the TEI to expand in a way that we can, it's still manageable?
Right. Now, that's a great question. So there's sort of two parts to the answer, two parts to the kind of answer I will give. The first is that the TEI customization mechanism, I think, is really designed to accommodate what you're describing. In other words, when I create a custom TEI schema, what I am doing is, first of all, formalizing a statement about what are the parts of the existing TEI that I will continue to use. And those become part of my schema. And then I can make statements about what aspects of those retained parts I want to change. So, for example, do I want to add a new set of values for the type attribute to let me say, these are the types of poem that I recognize, or these are the types of personhood that I'm willing to describe, or these are my set of values for what gender identity could be. Or other kinds of changes, like I don't think that in my universe poems actually consist of these things, I think that they consist of these other things. And then the final step in the process is to say, what is missing in the TEI? And what will I add? What are the new elements, in effect, the thoughts that I want to think, the differentiations I want to make that the TEI doesn't contemplate? And those then also become part of the customization. And at each of these stages, if you're doing the customization process properly, you're including in that very customization file an explanation in formal terms or in human language of the motivations for the change and how it maps onto existing parts of the TEI, if in fact it does. If it doesn't, then that's fine. But for example, if you, just to take an example from the Women Writers Project, the very, very tiny change that we made, there's an element in TEI called form work, FW, which is used for things like running headers. And the form, as people probably know, is the part of the printing apparatus that contains the comparatively unchanging parts of the page. So running headers, page numbers, catchwords, things like that. So, okay, great. There exists this element that's used for those features. The WWP had a set of features that are sort of analogous to form work, but not quite the same thing. For example, when you have a list that's broken across a page break, you often repeat the headings of the list. So that's not part of the form, but it's part of the apparatus of page breaking. So we wanted to add those to the list of things. But then we were like, yeah, but that's not, we shouldn't just add those to the meaning of form work, because that's really disrupting the social contract, for the rest of the TEI. When they look at it, they're like, that's not what that was meant for. So instead, we changed the name of the element. We changed it to metawork, MW. And in our schema, what we say is metawork is very similar to form work, right? We say it's the same element except with a new semantics and a new name. So what that does is it leaves a trail back to the center, to the place where the community is sitting talking their language, but it also allows us to be out here on the periphery using our own element that we created. That's a dumb little example, but you could imagine how it would extend to these other kinds of changes that I was just describing. So the customization document itself becomes both the blueprint for your schema and also the glosses on that blueprint, right? The explanation for why and how to read what you've done. Now, the limits of that explanation are the limits of human language. So, if you've done a very expressive job of that, it will be a full, useful document. And if you've done a kind of thin job of it, then it will be less useful. But I think that's really the mechanism by which that kind of differentiation would proceed. I feel like there was another part of your question that I wanted to answer, but I got so carried away that I've forgotten what it was. Archiving. Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that. The the customization mechanism, the mature version of the customization mechanism that I've been describing, really came about with P5, which was published in 2007, as Peter told us. And although that seems like a long time ago, in terms of the tool development cycle, it's not actually that long. And the reason I say that is because there is clearly a need for a tool that allows customizations to be compared. And more than that, a tool that could become part of an archiving environment that would enable multiple projects' data that use different customizations to be mapped onto one another in the places where they align and to disagree amicably in the places where they don't align. And this is something that I have close to my heart because one of the projects I'm responsible for is the TEI Archiving, Publishing, and Access Service, TAPAS, which is trying to be an archive for TEI data and a publisher for TEI data for people who don't have any way of doing that on their own. But it's clear to me that one of the really useful community functions such a thing could serve is precisely this creation of a kind of common repository of TEI data. And that common repository would be much, much more useful if it also had the schemas, not the schema in the literal sense, but the meta schema, the odd file, the customization file. And in my dreams, I see this currently imaginary tool, which would let me, for example, come to Tapas and say, find me all the data from projects that have eliminated the note element from their schema. Or find me all the data from the projects that use the cool queer schema that they developed at NYU in 2018. Or find me all the projects whose schemas are descendants of the cool queer schema that they developed at NYU in 2018. So that's the kind of question I'd like to be able to ask. And I'd like to be able to have visualizations that show me multiple schemas overlaid, kind of like a Hinman collator, where the places where they agree are invisible and the places where they disagree light up in red or something. I mean, that would be really neat. And I feel like we're 5 years away from that tool. I know that there are people in the TEI who also want this and are working on it, but we're all volunteers. So I think that's kind of the direction that line of thought would take us. So watch the space. That's the best I can do.
Hi, thank you so much. Your presentation was very, very helpful. And I guess I just have to start by saying that I consider myself kind of an outsider in this field. So my question is going to be like deviating a little bit from the technical side. Because I come from the background of a nonprofit practitioner who's currently doing graduate studies to have a better sense of urban data that can be sources of evidence for nonprofits that are doing initiatives for marginalized populations. And it was very striking for me when you mentioned institutional diversity being more leading to simplification, and how querying information technology is actually envisions a better way of dismantling systems and better than diversity. And I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about how you envision this technology, like TEI, doing that in institutions outside of academia and scholarship.
Yeah, that's an important question, and I'm not sure I'm going to have a really good answer, because I think sort of where I was going with that part of the presentation was really to contrast, on the one hand, bureaucratic settings where simplifications have some kind of limited utility, and the space of reflection and sort of infinite time that is supposedly the academy, where we can just keep problematizing things, for as long as we want and write papers about it. But we don't have to create working systems. And I feel as though maybe the sweet spot in between those, which is sort of what you're asking about, is systems that are open to our redesign. So systems that are not indebted to some existing entrenched bureaucracy like human resources, like Banner. Everybody has Banner. I'm sure Banner has a theory of gender, and it is not our theory of gender. Banner has a theory of vacation, and it is apparently not my theory of vacation. So first of all, it's systems that are open to our redesign, our critical redesign, but also then systems at an intellectual level or information level that represent identity, whatever axis of identity we're interested in in a way that is both serviceable and also open-ended, right? In other words, I imagine that I think we can imagine descriptive systems for identity that would operate in specific contexts rather than totalizing contexts, that would give us the level of grain that we need with appropriate places for saying there is also something uncountable here, something that is not been envisioned, right? That we need to be welcoming to the possibility that that N+1 term will walk in the door tomorrow, even though they haven't walked in the door yet. I think what's challenging there is not really the information design, because, you know, information systems are happy to accommodate as much plurality of terms as we want. The challenge is to create, how can I put this? If you think of these descriptive languages, of descriptive terminology, you know, lists of values, you know, male, female, other, whatever the values are, if you think of those lists as interfaces, right, as ways for information to be presented to a using, consuming audience, the question is, what's the function of that interaction? So in the cases that you're describing, the function of that interaction is not primarily just a kind of a free-floating critical reflection. It's presumably to provide services to people who need those services. And so there has to be some willingness to make descriptive acts, and there also has to be a kind of generous willingness to treat those descriptions as provisional, but not so provisional that they're not useful now, right? And so I feel as though the design problem there is not really about information design. It's a kind of community culture around information, right? How do we design communities that can think effectively at this moment about what their information needs are now, and in a way that envisions how those information needs are going to evolve, and can design information systems that can evolve gracefully with the evolution of the human reality. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm becoming way too abstract with this.
I guess I'm going to be an annoying person too and sort of ask a question from the outside world or partially inside it. I don't know. I'm part of Haystack, and so I guess I'm in the digital humanities, but I'm also outside of it because I'm in the field of theater and performance studies, and more specifically dance in a certain way, I guess. And I think my question spins off of everything that everyone has been saying. Queerness has been thrown around as a word, but not really discussed theoretically that much, I think, and I'm happy to hear here now that we are talking more about queerness as a horizon, kind of like Jose Munoz's term, right? Like something not yet here, something future, something that we need to stay open to. And I guess my question would be something like that. It sounds like there's a need to talk even more interdisciplinarily here, specifically from a perspective of dance. I'm thinking, when we think about queerness, we are thinking about gender and sexuality to begin with, somehow. And those are not textual. Those are bodily, right? And the body isn't in 2 dimensions. The body is in 3, potentially 4, maybe even more dimensions. And that made me think of texts that are also built on movement. Zara's poetic writing with letters that are supposed to float around on the page, and my favorite is pop-up books, and like how to get those into a text encoding initiative, but then also how do we move from that to bodies that are moving in space, movement, gender as something that is embodied, right? And maybe that's outside of the scope of a text encoding initiative. Maybe we're moving slightly beyond text. But I guess my question then becomes, are there people involved in the consortium that are outside of text studies? And to what extent are they helping out with this? Because I think that would be a really interesting way. That's not a question, that's a comment. Ugh,
It's a great question.
Sorry.
No, it's a great
Thank
question.
you.
I'll be happy with that question. So a couple different things suggest themselves to me, and knowing me, I'm going to answer one of them and lose track of the other. So let me think about this for a second. So first of all, there is a a sibling-derived encoding language called the Music Encoding Initiative, which is dealing with musical texts. So yes, still texts, but dealing with temporality to some extent. And also with the complicated problem of temporality that has been textualized, which is interesting. So another way that my brain goes with this is to say that really what we're calling text encoding here is a special case of a more general problem of information modeling. And the nerdy optimist in me wants to say, you can model any information, right? I mean, obviously it's harder than that. And text is a comparatively easy thing to model because as an inscription thing, it is readily modeled in other inscription systems. And the computer is ultimately an inscription system, right? I mean, it's all written, as Marcus showed us, it's written in ones and zeros. And then, there are abstractions on top of that, but basically it's a writing system. So text encoding, text has always been the kind of the first thing, the first part of the frontier to get conquered when you're talking about digital stuff. However, XML and other imaginable information modeling systems is capable of representing, I'll say boldly and hopefully that nobody's going to contradict me, any information that you want to model. So for example, SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, is an XML language for representing shapes, and I believe it can also represent moving shapes. So okay, that's a tiny example, but it suggests that if we can model the movement of bodies in space and time with our brains, we can represent that model in some form of XML. Now, tactically, that might or might not be the best way of going about it. I mean, we may or may not get the kinds of analytical results we want. And one way to sort of test that, or one kind of case we might look at, is the analogous case of images and transcribed text. Right? People often ask, why do you bother to transcribe it? I can just read the page image, it's so much cheaper. And of course the answer is the page image isn't textual data, it's dots of color on a background. And you can't search it and you can't analyze it and you can't process it, whereas the linguistic version, the ASCII version, the Unicode version can be all these other things. And similarly with SVG, if we think of SVG in comparison with a bitmap, SVG actually has information about curves and shapes and containment. You can reason with it. You can say this circle is inside this other circle. It's moving to the left, things like that. And so similarly, we could imagine that although a video of, Baryshnikov is more of a rich representation of a dance, that let's say, SVG for dance representation would be a useful strategic simplification of that information for some purposes, for example, as another way of representing gesture. And the limits of that usefulness would be the limits of the granularity at which those things are represented. So if all we have is like semaphore, either it's straight up or it's this, okay, maybe that's not so useful. But if it can be more fine-grained, if it can be the TEI of representing dance rather than the HTML of representing dance, then potentially that would have some potential. So I'm trying to sort of sketch in the space of possibility here. Nothing like that exists at the moment as far as I'm aware, and I've been very peripherally involved in at least one conversation about how to represent things like basic dance notation in some kind of XML language, and those conversations did not get very far. But that doesn't mean that better, smarter, more dedicated people aren't succeeding somewhere in the world. So I think it's an area to look for, but I think it's also an area that might be waiting for a better meta language, right? It's not obvious to me that XML is like the perfect match here. So, yeah. Did that answer your question? Okay, cool.
But I think all of the issues that Julia has raised in that incredibly rich and interesting paper are going to come back in very. Thank you so much for an incredible talk.